Hello and good morning. Welcome to your morning briefing for Tuesday, the 6th of May, 2025. I'm your host, Mike Shelby. Thank you so much for being with us here this morning. We have a lot to get to. A lot happened overnight that we'll cover. For now, let's go ahead and jump inside the Beltway here. The Justice Department, under Attorney General Pam Bondi, has opened an investigation into Hennepin County, that is in Minnesota. By the way, that's the county where George Floyd happened. And let's see here. Oh, hang on. Sorry, guys. Getting this pulled up here. All right. By the way, I'm covering for Robert for the next several days. All right. The Justice Department announced a new investigation into the Hennepin County Attorney's Office and the county attorney herself, Mary Moriarty, in Minnesota. The DOJ intends to determine whether Moriarty is racially discriminating after she publicly adopted a policy to consider racial identity in prosecutorial decision making. Apparently, Moriarty is considering race in terms of who gets prosecuted and who does not. So this is not directly affecting the Shiloh Hendricks case, which we talked about shortly yesterday. That's in southern Minnesota. But Moriarty has been involved in the Minnesota justice system since 2014, and she made a statewide name for herself since 2019. And she consistently flanks Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison from the left, which is pretty far left. And so the Department of Justice there is investigating that. Also, there is a new report about a month ago. The National Intelligence Council issued this report. It's recently been declassified. Jared, if you can go ahead and hit that slide. And the National Intelligence Council found that there is no link between the Venezuelan government and this transnational criminal organization / foreign terrorist organization now called Tren de Aragua. This is important because first of all, it's definitely not definitive. However, earlier this year, you may recall, there's a former CIA officer named Gary Berntsen, and he claimed that this Tren de Aragua gang received paramilitary training and funding from the government of Venezuela to carry out operations in the United States. Benson further claimed that he provided intelligence to the CIA. He said he had proof of this. He provided it to CIA during the Biden administration, and CIA was directed to ignore these claims. So now let's get to this National Intelligence Council. By the way, this is under the Director of National Intelligence. So DNI, Tulsi Gabbard, approved of this release, and this is important for a couple of reasons. Number one, this report finds that those claims, they say, have not been corroborated. They say the NIC says the Venezuelan government is, quote, not directing TDA movement or operations in the United States. And they further report that analysts could not corroborate claims that Venezuelan officials fund or direct these Tren de Aragua cells inside the United States, and also that the U.S. intelligence community does not rely on local press reports about the relationship between the Venezuelan government and TDA, quote, given the highly polarized media environment. I read through this morning, and I'll just say, for now, this is the intelligence community's analytic line. They say there's no relationship between the Venezuelan government and Tren de Aragua, which undercuts this whole Trump administration thing where they're trying to use the Alien Enemies Act to go after Tren de Aragua. So this report was released by the Director of National Intelligence, and they found this no direction or command relationship between the Venezuelan government and TDA. However, you read through here. By the way, I do have this report up for Early Warning Network subscribers. It's over in the library. Just hit the Intel Vault tab, and you can see all the stuff we have in there. This report uses words like probably. Okay, so probably is very key here. This is called estimative language. And when you use a term like probably, it indicates a substantial level of uncertainty. This does not say likely or almost certainly. It says probably, which leaves room, just in terms of probability, leaves room for 25 to 40% that this is not the case. Okay, so probably is above 50-50, but it is not. They don't say likely, which is key here. They say probably. And also, this conclusion here that they make seems to rely on an absence of positive indicators. So these are things that you would expect to see, but don't. And they point out there is an absence of evidence, which does not mean they do not say that evidence does not exist. They just say they're unable to see any evidence here, which is also important. So there's not a everything I read here and read in this thing is just not definitive. It kind of screams. I don't know if this has some political effect, or they don't want to rock the boat or cause maybe some big diplomatic row with the Venezuelan government. One very important part of this declassified report is that the National Intelligence Council rejects an FBI finding that actually does link Tren de Aragua with the Venezuelan government. So again, nothing in this report is definitive. It is at least plausible that, as the FBI claims, there are some elements of the Maduro regime that are using TDA to destabilize the United States. That was the FBI's finding. Even if there is no direct oversight or command, this may not be the case where Maduro is giving orders to TDA. I look at this, I think it's far more plausible that TDA is kind of being used as a wind-up toy, whereby the Venezuelan government provides training and facilitates movement to the United States without providing direct oversight or direct orders. So there is no command relationship. I think that's at least plausible, but plausibility is not proof. I obviously can't prove that. Meanwhile, media outlets are pointing out this report, and they're saying that it undermines the Trump administration's use of the Alien Enemies Act to target TDA and other transnational criminal organizations that are operating inside the United States. As I said, this National Intelligence Council report does point out that the FBI did find links back to the Maduro government. However, I read the Politico take on this and the New York Times report on this declassified report, and neither of those outlets mentioned that the FBI found links between the Venezuelan government and TDA, somewhat conveniently. Now, one other consideration is how President Trump or the White House responds to this finding, because this was approved by the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, may not have been approved by Tulsi Gabbard herself. However, this does, I would say this does probably undercut, in the eyes of some, undercut the Trump administration's claims. So maybe this gets reconsidered in the near future in light of its impact on the use of the Alien Enemies Act. And with that, let's go ahead and jump into some rollups. I thought this was funny. Morgan Stanley published a report recently, and they said that the humanoid robot market is going to reach $5 trillion by the year 2050, and they expect 1 billion humanoid robots to be in operation by 2050. I think they said most of those would be in China. But, you've probably seen videos of isn't it Tesla, I think, that's making a humanoid robot as well that's going to, do your laundry and clean your dishes or something like that. All right. Also, moving on here to FEMA, they're warning of increased fire potential this summer. This was by the way, every day Jared posts the FEMA operations brief over on the Early Warning Network. So if you don't want to go track that down yourself and you want us to deliver it to you, that's fine. Go join us, www.earlywarningnetwork.com. We post this report every day. And it looks like there's significant wildland fire potential for outlook here. This is from FEMA for parts of the U.S. You can see it there on your screen. Also, I thought this was interesting. There was a Barclays report that came out recently that said the Trump tariffs threaten about 3% of the total Chinese job market. And that's about 20 million jobs. Also, there was a pretty interesting take from Deutsche Bank last week. Some Deutsche Bank analysts went to, and I guess asset managers went to China. And they came back and they wrote a report on all these conversations they had with Chinese investors and their Chinese clients. And they said in every single conversation they had, their Chinese clients wanted to buy gold. And that was the first big thing, which is not a surprise, but China's been buying gold for like 18 months straight or something like that at this point. So they've been adding to their gold reserves for a long time. Another thing is they said the overall outlook on the Chinese was that, yes, this is the Trump trade war is painful to China. And they said all their clients were supportive of Chinese hardline action against Trump, basically not giving in. And they said that they think it will resolve, this trade war will resolve in like 1 to 2 months. They said the United States is hurting China bad, and the United States kind of drew first blood, so to speak. But they said in about 1 to 2 months, we're going to start seeing these supply chain problems hit the United States. And they said once that starts to induce some economic pain for the United States, they said they think Trump's going to come to the table and hammer out a deal. So maybe a deal is still 1 to 2 months away. And with that, Jared, good morning. Let's turn our attention here to the Indo-Pacific region. RE4PAC, what is that?
So it's actually had two different meanings, thanks to the Air Force's bureaucracy. But right now it means Resolute Force Pacific. It used to mean return of forces to the Pacific, in the same vein as return of forces to Europe, which was an old Cold War exercise that did the same thing. And I think that's a very important point because the U.S. has been running this for several decades, but now they're shifting to a different theater. Anyway, the Air Force Chief of Staff, General Ulvin, reiterated that RE4PAC will take place this summer. This exercise is going to involve 300 aircraft, 2,000 U.S. Air Force personnel, and test rapid deployment and sustained logistics under threat in the Indo-Pacific. And all of this is actually supposed to be in the lead up to Talisman Sabre, which is an Australian-led exercise in July. So they are literally planning to deploy into Talisman Sabre as a practice for maintaining aerial logistics. Moving over to India, actually on a similar note of drills, the Indian Ministry of Home Affairs asked several states to run civil defense drills on Wednesday in order to practice evacuations and self-defense. The drills are going to include air raid sirens, blackout preparations, and rapid camouflaging exercises for critical infrastructure.
That's very interesting, Jared. This is not the first time India has run these civil defense exercises. I think back in 2023, I want to say, they launched their largest maritime security exercise they've ever done, and it's a coastal and maritime exercise, so it's predominantly naval. However, they also did involve local governments there, and I don't recall the exact details of this, but would you say this is an escalation of what we've seen previously? Because they've done that 2 years in a row now.
I think so. They did not publish the list of states, which to me says it's probably very near Kashmir, with the disputed region. I think it's preparation for a retaliation to any kind of action the Indians take on the Pakistanis.
Mm-hmm. All right. Great point.
And then lastly, the U.S. received a peace proposal from the Democratic Republic of the Congo and Rwanda. This is a draft peace proposal. They're working on it. And the big reason this stood out to me is we covered a couple of months ago, the DRC asked the U.S. for security assistance for this exact issue in exchange for access to the DRC's critical minerals, particularly cobalt. And cobalt is a mineral that's used for the steel used in jet engines, which would basically give the U.S. a significant form of leverage over producing modern navies, air forces, and missiles, all of which obviously needed for warfare going forward. And this is where China gets a lot of their cobalt for those systems.
Mm-hmm. All right. Yeah, that's also interesting. So basically, the United States is trying to sweep in and undercut China here on all this cobalt stuff. All right. Thanks for that, Jared. Let's go ahead and move on to Antifa. I tell you, this is the first major action we have seen this year. 4+ months into this year, we're seeing something in Seattle. So last night, roughly 36 Antifa militants clad in black bloc and wearing these gas masks, as you may be able to tell in the picture, staged a takeover of a campus building on the University of Washington. It went on for several hours, and there's a bunch of videos that you can see online. But in one of the videos, you can see a small contingent of maybe campus police or maybe Seattle Police Department officers are retreating early during the occupation because they are outnumbered probably 3 to 4 to 1 at least at that point. At any rate, a dispersal order was issued, and a couple hours later, maybe a few hours later, Seattle police arrived in riot gear, and they cleared out the occupation. According to local media, police arrested 30 militants. And they are being charged, reportedly, with disorderly conduct, trespassing, property destruction, and conspiracy. So I thought this was interesting. One of the reporters who was on the scene here described this as a low energy event, and he said this was this occupation was to protest against the Israeli war in Gaza. So this was not affiliated with May Day. It was not affiliated with traditional anti-Trump direct action, which is mostly what we have seen from Antifa going back to like 2016. And there's a question, did he say charged with conspiracy? Yes, conspiracy to commit disorderly conduct, trespassing, property destruction. So, yesterday I kind of made a big deal about the overall lack of Antifa direct action, which typically we do see during May Day. I said there were approximately zero. Turns out, just sorting through a bunch of news and also people sharing stuff, I think maybe there were two events of Antifa being arrested. One, I believe, was in Fredericksburg, Maryland, and the other was in either Salem or Eugene, Oregon, which are pretty typical Antifa towns anyway. But still, we're talking about very low, very, very low level of operations here. Even with this one, these guys, they did light fires, but that I saw, they weren't fighting with police. They went in there, they put up some chairs and tables to try to blockade the building. You can see this video of the police in riot gear going through there. They're just removing the chairs and tables and walking their way in, arresting all these guys and leaving. I don't want to say this is a non-event, but this is just not this is not your typical Black Bloc demonstration where they're like throwing bricks and using laser pointers to try to blind police and using fireworks or incendiaries. That reporter said it was a pretty low energy event. It really does, to me, also look like pretty low energy. One other point I want to make here, a couple of people who are on the scene made a point to say that this was allowed to go on for far too long. But I do want to point out, we're not talking about a multi-day occupation here. This is in a few hours. Seattle police arrived. They arrested these people. Now, maybe the charge will be dropped later. I don't know. But at least for now, they are being charged, which is distinctly different from what we saw in 2020, even going into 2021. And even then, we're talking about in the first 4+ months of 2025, we're talking about one major Antifa action in Seattle, which is exactly where you would expect it. And so fundamentally, nothing changes on my previous outlook on Antifa. I still think they're weak. I still think they're trying to rebuild. I still think there's a lack of urgency. I mean, this is not anti-Trump direct action. This has nothing to do with mass deportations, or maybe you don't call them mass deportations, but it has nothing to do with that. It has nothing to do with ICE. It has to do with Israel-Gaza. And so I think that's also a very, very pertinent point. I guess one other point I'd make, it seems to be like the consensus to explain the lack of Antifa activity or campaigns is a lack of funding. I put this up on X, and a lot of people, the overwhelming consensus is that there is no Antifa activity because USAID got clipped and their funding has dried up. And if that were the case, I'm not saying that has zero bearing on this, but if that were the case, the thing that I try to explain to people is that these guys do not need funding. They don't need funds to go put on a black hoodie and go and fight with cops or go and try to occupy a campus building. We're not talking about multi-million-dollar budgets here. They don't need the funding. And I think there's way too much emphasis is put on funding. I'll have a much longer report on this later in the week. However, for now, let's go ahead and move on. All right. The USDA, U.S. Department of Agriculture, has announced a fraud investigation into SNAP, aka those are the food stamps. And they announced this last week, and they said that they conducted a major operation to stop benefits theft in Los Angeles in conjunction with the Secret Service and Homeland Security investigations. USDA says they surveilled over 100 locations in Southern California for card skimmers and cloned point-of-sale terminals. USDA claims numerous arrests came out of this operation, and that the investigation, quote, shows that international criminal organizations are heavily involved in benefiting from SNAP fraud. So very interesting point there. Let's move on to the next item. All right, Jared, we've heard that Israel is preparing to move into Gaza and I guess occupy it indefinitely or take it over. What exactly are we talking about here?
This certainly looks like it will be indefinite because they intend to use the Israeli Defense Forces to just expel and then occupy the territory from which they expelled the Gazans. And this is all coming from Israel's National Security Cabinet. And I just saw this morning that the Prime Minister officially said, yes, we are going forward with this. They passed a plan dubbed Gideon's Chariots for the total conquest of Gaza. Now, the plan, like I said, involves an evacuation of the entire Gazan population and the subsequent occupation of the territory. Israel does say that the plan will not go forward until after President Trump's visit to Israel later this month. I thought this was an interesting tit for tat as well. The Israeli defense officials claim that Hamas can still come to a hostage deal prior to the visit in order to prevent the operation, so they are seemingly give them an out. But a senior Hamas official named Bassem Naim went on record last night stating that Hamas is not interested in any peace talks as long as Israel continues the war in Gaza. So it sounds like this is going to go forward no matter what, probably near the end of the month. And in support of this, the Israeli government is in the process of recalling tens of thousands of reservists for the operation. I tried to find a hard number on that, and it seems like it's kind of an open-ended number.
Mm-hmm. All right, so if you're Egypt, if you're Turkey, both of those countries have previously said something like this would be a red line. I mean, Egypt was talking about running in there through the military or using their military to stop an Israeli further incursions previously. We've also heard similar rhetoric from Turkey here. This seems to be like an Arab red line, or at least a regional red line. Has there been any response from any of these countries?
I haven't seen anything that deviates from the norm yet. They've been saying it constantly for, I think it's at 19 months now. So there's that. I am going to keep a very close eye on the Israeli-Turkish relations, though, given the tensions we've seen in Syria and the fact that the Turks did jam a jet over the weekend. That I'll leave it at that.
So
I will keep an eye on
an
it.
electronic warfare attack on an Israeli jet.
Yes, which is an act of war.
Mm-hmm. All right. Thanks for that, Jared. And that's going to do it for our main stuff. We do have some questions here in the chat. I've seen multiple reports in the last few days about police being attacked / targeted. Do you guys see this as an uptick? Yeah, I've also seen that. I mean, was it in Cincinnati? I think there was a father whose son was involved in a police chase. Apparently the son pulled a gun on cops or like reached for a gun or something like that. He was killed, I believe, in this police involved shooting. A day later, his father jumps in the vehicle and he rams into and kills, strikes a police officer who I think was conducting traffic or something like that. Completely unrelated to the situation. But yeah, he just goes and kills another. Maybe it wasn't Cincinnati. I don't remember where it was. So I have seen those. I wouldn't say this is like part of a broader uptick necessarily. Like maybe I could. There's a thing called is it recency bias? Basically, where when you see multiple news stories, you think, oh wow, this stuff is happening much more frequently. And it's not. It's just the case that media is covering it. Those things have been happening all along. We just haven't been hearing about it, and we only think there's an increase because we see it in the media. I'm not saying that's what's going on. I have not seen an uptick in police, the targeting of police or attacking of police. But if you have a different take, I certainly would be interested in hearing it. Next question. Make a good point that Antifa idiots will be idiots for free. But don't you think degrading their funding and organization will degrade the effectiveness and coordination of their activity? I think honestly, I cannot overstate the impact of that Georgia RICO case over Stop Cop City. I've talked about it many times before. You have 60 or 61 militants and activists being arrested, charged with conspiracy under these RICO laws. a handful charged with under some kind of domestic terror statutes. That has such a large impact that Stop Cop City folded up, and like it doesn't even like it exists kind of as a movement, but there is no like Stop Cop City campaign anymore. They closed up shop and they stopped. I think that, and police departments actually making arrests, and district attorneys going after these people and actually charging them, and the charges are sticking and they're actually going into criminal trials. I think that has had a far greater impact than funding. What do you need funding for? It's like these Molotov cocktails. A lot of people said, oh, the Tesla fire bombings, that's Soros money, being paid by Soros money. You can build a Molotov for less than $20. The fuel included. You don't need hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars being funneled into an organization to go do something like that. As I said, these people will be dip S's for free. They'll be idiots for free. You don't have to pay them. So the question really is, well, what does the funding go to? Like, what is the funding for? A lot of people made a big deal yesterday when I posted this on X. A lot of people said, oh, USAID money is cut. Therefore, there's been no Antifa activity. Well, there's no Antifa activity back during Biden when presumably money was still flowing to them. I mean, if that's the argument. And if USAID money was cut, it doesn't explain how roughly 36, at least 30 people were arrested. So at least 30 people took part in this University of Washington campus. You can look at the pictures. Most of them are in black bloc attire. There's a couple of these little headdresses and like white, whatever keffiyehs or whatever you call them. But this has all the hallmarks of an Antifa black bloc direct action operation. If the funding was cut, why were they able to get 30 people to go do this? So I think the funding argument is tenuous at best. There are far greater explanations to why Antifa is inactive. And I think the criminal charges and the arrests and let me just ask this. If this was actually like Seattle, whatever Antifa, what did they get out of this? Okay, they had this direct action demonstration. They're allowed to occupy this building for a few hours, according to reports. They get arrested, they get booked. Those bookings, I'm sure someone is going to start pulling out all those, the booking information. They're going to be doxxed. What did they get out of this? I mean, they had no impact on Israel or Gaza. Now they all get identified. So what was the actual purpose of this? What did they get out of it? So other than just to make a statement. Now, maybe you could make the case and say, well, because this is the biggest Antifa action we've seen this year, it may encourage other affinity groups to go out and commit acts of direct action. And I actually think that's like a pretty good argument. I think that's a pretty good case to be made there. But just in terms of funding, impacting organization and effectiveness and coordination, they don't need money to do that. They don't need money to organize. They do that for free. They don't need funding to coordinate these activities. They'll go to a park and 20 or 30 of them will show up and they'll basically achieve some consensus, or they'll like vote on what they want to do. And then a few nights or a few weeks later, they go and do it. No funding required. So I think there's a big, I think people are conflating two different things here. Conflating the national level protest and activist organizations, which are funded. It does cost money to spin up a website. It does cost money to, you have to pay these organizers to go organize these large scale mass demonstrations. You do not have to pay Antifa, pardon my French, but you don't have to pay Antifa to go be dipshits. They'll do that for free. So all this funding stuff over Antifa is a completely wrong approach to trying to understand that they don't need funding to go out and do this stuff. Is my final point, and we'll move on. Jared, next question. Was Antifa mostly giving money to lawyers to get people out of jail and pay their bonds? I don't think Antifa was giving money to anyone. You have the National Lawyers Guild, which the green hats at all these protests and stuff. By the way, I didn't see any green hats in the pictures last night. But the National Lawyers Guild are there to protect Antifa's civil rights. they will go. They're all attorneys, or most of them are attorneys. They go. They do this stuff for free. Whoever's funding them, I don't know. But they go and they make sure that law enforcement is not violating the rights of these militants. So Antifa is not giving money to anyone. These organizations exist in parallel to these Antifa direct action cells or these affinity groups, and that money was they're being funded somehow. Now, whether USAID money was going to National Lawyers Guild, I don't know. I don't have the receipts. You'll have to go back, and someone who has that information will have to go back and actually look into it. I don't know. If you think the tactic of direct action by Antifa is broken due to the RICO case in Georgia, what do you think the far left's new TTP may change to? Honestly, I think they're still trying to figure that out. Starting in May and August of 2024, there are these two, I think they're important. They're important strategy sessions. You have this it's kind of national level roughly anarchist organization trying to develop a strategy. And they said, look, we're going into the election season. We could see a Trump administration in 2025, and we need to figure out what we're going to do. So they did that in May, and then there was another one in August of 2024. And honestly, I still think they're trying to figure that out. I think they're unpopular. Antifa is not what it was. This is no longer 2020. I don't think the average American is willing to put up with disruption. So look, you've in any kind of response to this, you've basically got roughly three responses. You've got some level of support, some level of acquiescence or indifference in the middle, and then you've got opposition. And the question is, how long can these groups operate when most Americans are no longer acquiescing like they did in 2020, and they're actively, in some cases, actually opposed to these kind of disruptive and sometimes violent direct action demonstrations, or destructive, I'll say just at least destructive direct action demonstrations. I'm not sure how long you can operate when the people around you do not acquiesce and law enforcement is actually going after you and making arrests, and then you turn around and get charged by the DA. So what other TTPs may change to? Smaller but more violent. That's what I said starting in the middle of last year. Antifa, these far left groups, are going to be smaller but more violent. So far, we have not seen the more violent thing. Maybe you can make a case that, some of these leftist actors firebombing the Teslas would be more violent than what we have seen since 2021. But even then, when was the last Tesla firebombing? There hasn't been one in a long time. Why? Because most of these people were charged. Now, I think there were two. There was one trans person who was released because it was inhumane or something, because he or she, whatever, was trans. I think that happened up in Minnesota or Wisconsin, about the place you'd expect it to happen. So in terms of where the TTPs may change to, in short, I think they're still trying to figure that out. I think they mostly don't know exactly how to proceed. And I'll just say maybe two other things here. Number one, I reported on extensively. I listen to these guys' podcasts. I read their blogs. Several of them they had these entire podcasts about how they were demoralized and that this revolution that they had in 2020 failed. And one even said that it was laughable to even think about launching some other far left revolutionary movement. He said it was laughable to even think that they could do that again. And so you have these militants actually having substantial doubt about what they're going to be able to do in the future. So I think that's a big problem. I think they have been demoralized. I think they have been disillusioned maybe by this revolutionless revolution. So at any rate, I forgot what my second point was going to be. Probably not important. Smaller, more violent as they lose support and become less relevant. That's another thing I said last October. I said, look, the far left, this Antifa stuff, these Antifa groups face becoming irrelevant because they haven't done anything. And, this is the first action we've seen so far this year, the first major action. There have been some minor things in Portland and Seattle, but nothing to make anyone pay attention to. And so I do think there's a struggle for relevancy here. And so maybe that will cause some of them to be more extreme or take more destructive or maybe violent. TTP, by the way, tactics, techniques, and procedures, TTPs. Maybe that will urge some to become more extreme, more violent in their actions just to remain relevant. Otherwise, Antifa, I said last year, BLM is a non-entity. No, there are some BLM protests. But when's the last time you heard anything significant about BLM? You haven't, because they're irrelevant. And I think maybe Antifa will face, at least temporarily, facing the same conditions here. All right. Anything else? Who pays for pallets of bricks? I don't know. Let me also address this. Ben Tisa says that basically law enforcement is key in curbing Antifa activity, but funding has little to no effect. Funding has little to no effect on the direct action cells. These people do not need to be paid. It's not like they have multi-million-dollar equipment. It's not like organizing. They're not trying to organize 1 million people. They're trying to organize like 5 or 10 or 20 or 30, as we saw last night. And they basically just put out an all call, or it's most of this stuff's probably gonna be word of mouth unless it's pre-announced. This was not. I didn't see anything about it, but it didn't look pre-announced to me. Maybe it was. Typically in these cities, when you get a pre-announced black bloc demonstration, typically it draws a lot larger law enforcement response. We actually have seen in Seattle. So if this thing was unannounced, this is organized by word of mouth. It's not like they're publishing stuff on Instagram and Reddit and all these other social media channels that they use, the little nooks and crannies where they live online. So yeah, I would say their law enforcement response has had a much larger impact on Antifa direct action cells or the affinity groups than funding. People make way too big a deal on the funding stuff for Antifa. Now the mainstream establishment progressive protest groups and the community organizers, yeah, they got to get paid. Those are real jobs. Antifa's not a real job. I don't think anybody's cutting checks to Rose City Antifa to go riot. Maybe there was some trickle down money that came in 2020. Other than that, these guys are not getting paid. But that exists. That's like built into the zeitgeist of the American right. No one will do anything if they don't get paid. They'll do this stuff for free. They have done it all the time for free. All right. Jared, I think that's it. All right, everyone. Thanks so much for the support. That's going to do it for today's briefing, which is ending, but the show goes on over at Early Warning Network. Head over to www.earlywarningnetwork.com. Great way to stay up to date on all the things that matter at home and abroad. Start a free 7-day trial, earlywarningnetwork.com. We appreciate the support. And we'll be back in your inbox tomorrow morning, back on the show starting at 08 Central Time. Until then, be well and stay out front.